Here's a thread that connects three very different stories today. What happens when an old assumption stops holding? About the ground beneath our homes, about the rules around a new machine, and about the limits of the human body. One story is a warning, one is a fight nobody wants to have, and one is genuinely hopeful. Let's start with the water, because for a huge stretch of America right now, it will not stop rising. A relentless, days-long assault of thunderstorms has brought devastating flooding across the American Midwest. And as of the latest reporting, it is not over. At least 3 people have died. More than 150,000 people were without power. Indiana and Ohio have been among the hardest-hit states, with some areas getting more than 11 inches of rain over the past week. And the National Weather Service is forecasting still more heavy rain through at least Sunday across the Ohio Valley, the Midwest, and the Central Appalachians, dumping more water onto ground that is already completely saturated, where floodwaters had only just started to recede. Indiana is seeking federal aid. I want to zero in on one single number, because it tells you why this particular event deserves more than a passing glance. In Anderson, Indiana, the White River rose to a record 24.9 feet. And here's the part that should stop you. That broke a flood mark that had stood since 1913. For 113 years, through the Great Depression, through World Wars, through every storm the last century could throw at that town, the river had never gotten that high. Until now. When a record that has held for over a century falls, that is not just bad weather. That is a signal that the baseline itself may be shifting. And this is where I want to be critical, not in a partisan way, but in the sense of pushing past the easy framing. Because the easy way to cover a flood is rain fell, river rose, sad story, move on to the next thing. But the real story is in the deeper mechanics, and there are 2 of them worth understanding. The first is what the experts are actually warning about, and it's not just the rain that already fell, it's the cascade. Here's the dangerous dynamic the National Weather Service and NOAA are flagging. The rain that's still coming is landing on ground that is already full. When soil is saturated, it can't absorb any more. So nearly all of that new rainfall runs straight off into creeks and streams and rivers. And here's the cruel geometry of a flood. As that water flows downstream, the risk doesn't stay put. It moves in compounds, threatening every community downriver, even towns that aren't getting much rain themselves. Rain gauges were recording nearly 10 inches at an airport in Iowa, 8 inches in Ohio, 6 inches in Kentucky. All of that water has to go somewhere, and where it goes is downhill, into the next town and the next. So a flood isn't one event. It's a slow-motion chain reaction that keeps claiming new victims for days after the storm that started it. The second, harder question is the one the century-old record forces us to ask, and I'm going to ask it carefully, because I promised you I wouldn't overstate what the facts support. You cannot scientifically blame any single flood on climate change in isolation. Weather is chaotic, and one event is one data point. That's the honest caveat, and anyone who skips it is selling certainty they don't have. But, and this is the critical but, a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. That's not politics, it's basic physics. Warmer air can carry more water vapor, which means when storms do form, they can dump more rain in a shorter time. So while I won't tell you this specific flood was caused by climate change, I will tell you that breaking a 113-year-old record fits precisely the pattern scientists have long predicted. Not necessarily more storms, but more intense ones, dropping historic amounts of rain and shattering records that stood for generations. The critical takeaway isn't a slogan, it's this. If the records that defined the worst case for a century are now falling, then the infrastructure, the flood maps, the insurance models, and the emergency plans built around those old records may all be quietly out of date. We may be defending against a 100-year flood with defenses designed for a weaker one. So, as this unfolds over the coming days, and the water is still rising as I record this, watch for that downstream cascade and hold the people of Indiana and Ohio in your thoughts. But also sit with the deeper unease. When a river beats a record that stood since 1913, the question isn't just, how do we clean up? It's, were we prepared for the right size of disaster, and are we going forward? Now, from a danger falling out of the sky to a danger a lot of families are, with the best intentions, parking in their own garage. Let's talk about e-bikes and kids, because this is a genuinely hard one, with no villains and a lot of hard choices. Across the country, traumatic injuries and even deaths are surging among children involved in crashes on e-bikes and other electrified two-wheelers. And this isn't a vague impression. The data is stark. A health analytics firm, Truveta, found a 7.5-fold increase in e-bike and e-scooter injury rates since 2023. 7.5 times. And the doctors treating these kids stress that it's not just the number of injuries, it's the severity. As one UC San Diego physician who led a statewide study put it, people on these machines are generally far more severely injured than they'd be on a regular pedal bicycle. And the patients tend to be younger, unhelmeted, and as a result, hurt much worse. A regular kid's bike tops out at whatever a child's legs can pedal. An e-bike, or a souped-up e-motorcycle, can go 20, 28, sometimes far more miles per hour, with a child's body and a child's judgment behind the handlebars. And here's the response that's making headlines, and it's a provocative one. In California, the Orange County District Attorney's Office has started pursuing criminal charges against the parents of some young riders. They've charged at least 4 people. One case involves the mother of a 14-year-old accused of killing an elderly pedestrian while riding an e-motorcycle. A father pleaded not guilty to child endangerment after prosecutors say he bought his 12-year-old an e-motorcycle and helped him illegally modify it to go faster, and the boy then ran a red light and was hit by a car. So the question on the table, bluntly, is, when a kid gets hurt or hurts someone else on one of these machines, should the parents go to jail? Let me give you both sides, because this genuinely divides reasonable people. The case for holding parents responsible: an adult bought the machine, an adult handed it to a child, and in some cases, an adult helped make it faster and more dangerous. If you give a 12-year-old a vehicle that can hit highway-adjacent speeds and something goes horribly wrong, the argument goes, that's not just tragic luck, that's a choice an adult made. And the case against. One defense lawyer called the charges absurd and said his client was being made a scapegoat. The worry there is that you're taking a grieving or terrified parent, someone who bought a popular product sold openly in stores, and treating a parenting decision as a crime, when the real failure is systemic. And systemic is the word I want to land on, because underneath the parent-blaming headline is a loophole that I think is the actual story. Here it is. Under federal law, most e-bikes are classified as non-motorized vehicles. Legally, they're treated like a regular bicycle, which means, in many places, riders don't need a license, don't need insurance, and aren't even required to wear a helmet. Sit with the mismatch there. We have created a category of vehicle that can go as fast as a moped or a small motorcycle, and we've legally defined it as a bicycle. So, a machine with the speed of a motor vehicle carries none of the safeguards of one. No age gate, no license, no mandatory helmet. That's not a parenting failure. That's a regulatory gap you could drive a truck through, and families are left navigating what one report called a patchwork of confusing, contradictory local laws to figure out what's even legal for their kid to ride. Now, different places are trying different fixes, and it's worth noting them, because it shows there's no consensus yet. New York City's mayor sent cease and desist notices to online retailers selling illegal e-bikes after a 17-year-old died. Neighboring New Jersey now requires e-bike riders to be at least 15 and to get a license and registration. And a teenage safety advocate quoted in the coverage, a 17-year-old herself, put it, "I think, better than any official, the fix has to be a mix of parental accountability from the manufacturers and retailers who make and sell these things, and education for kids about the rules of the road." In other words, blaming any single party, just the parents, just the companies, just the kids, misses that the whole chain failed. So here's my take, and I'll be direct about the tension in it. I understand the instinct to charge a parent who bought a child a dangerous, illegally modified machine. In the most extreme cases, that's a genuinely reckless act. But if we make this mainly a story about locking up individual parents, we let the far bigger players off the hook. The regulatory system that calls a 28-mile-per-hour vehicle a bicycle, and the retailers cheerfully selling these things to families without a word about whether they're street legal or safe for a child. Prosecuting one grieving mother is visible and satisfying and cheap. Rewriting the rules so these machines are classified honestly and sold responsibly is harder, slower, and less dramatic. But it's the thing that would actually protect kids. The question I'll leave you with: when a whole system is set up to fail, is it justice to prosecute the last person in the chain, or is it just easier? And speaking of new technology and the human body, let me end somewhere genuinely hopeful. Because after a flood and a debate about injured children, we could all use it. This one is about engineering not putting a child in danger, but giving a man his leg back. At the Gregorio Marañón Hospital in Madrid, surgeons have just done something described as a world first. They designed, manufactured, and implanted the first personalized metamaterial bone prosthesis. Let me explain what that actually means, because the science here is beautiful. The patient was a 38-year-old man with a high-grade sarcoma, a cancer, in his tibia, his shin bone. After an infection and severe loss of bone density, his bone couldn't support a conventional implant, and the doctors said they had no alternative to amputating his leg. There was nothing on the market that could save the leg without sacrificing the knee joint. So they built something that didn't exist. The key is that word, metamaterial. A metamaterial is a material engineered to have properties that its raw ingredient doesn't naturally have. Its power comes from its structure, not just its substance. In this case, instead of replacing the bone with a solid chunk of titanium, they created a lattice, a network of millimeter-scale titanium rods. 3D printed, designed to distribute weight and stress through the leg the same way real bone tissue does. And here's the detail I love. This exact technology comes from the aerospace industry. It's the same principle engineers use to make satellites and aircraft light enough to fly, but strong enough to survive extreme stress. They took space-age engineering and put it inside a human leg, and the personalization is the genuinely futuristic part. Using scans of the patient's healthy leg, the team built what they called a digital twin, a virtual replica, and then simulated the real forces a shin bone absorbs while walking, climbing stairs, even stumbling. From that data, they calculated point by point exactly how the internal lattice needed to be shaped so that weight would travel only through the areas the remaining bone could actually bear, and precisely where to place the fixing screws. They effectively engineered a custom bone for one specific human being's one specific leg. A year after the operation, after nearly 2 years of not being able to put weight on that leg, the patient is walking again. Now, I try to be consistent, so let me apply a little critical thought even to good news, not to dampen it, but to be honest about what it is and isn't. One successful case is a milestone, not yet a proven, widely available treatment. That's just the honest scientific caveat, and the doctors know it. The real test is whether this can be reproduced, scaled, and made affordable. Because hyper-personalized medicine like this, a bespoke digital twin and a custom 3D printed implant for every patient, is, by its nature, expensive and labor-intensive. The promise is enormous. The question is always whether it reaches ordinary people or stays a marvel for the few. But here's why I'm genuinely optimistic about this one, and why it's the right note to end on. 2 things. First, the hospital isn't treating it as a one-off. They've already performed a second similar procedure, and they're preparing 2 more personalized implants, one for a wrist, one for a sternum. That's not a stunt. That's the beginning of a program. And second, and this matters, this was done in a public hospital, with the stated goal of rolling the technology out to offer hyper-personalized medicine within the public health system. So the ambition isn't to build a luxury product. It's to take genuinely space-age engineering and make it a standard tool for saving ordinary people's limbs. That's the version of technological progress worth cheering for. Not a gadget that dazzles, but a quiet piece of engineering that lets a man keep his leg and walk again. So let me tie all 3 together. Because the thread runs through all of them. A river that broke a record set in 1913, forcing us to ask whether our defenses match the disasters we now face. A machine that outran the rules written for it, leaving families and prosecutors fighting over who's to blame. And a bone that engineers rebuilt from scratch when the human body's own limits ran out. Each one is a story about an old assumption breaking. The assumption that the past tells us the worst a river can do, that a bicycle is a safe, simple thing, that a shattered bone means a lost limb. In two of these stories, the assumption broke and caught us unprepared. In the third, human ingenuity broke the old limit on purpose and gave someone their life back. So here's what I'll leave you with. The world keeps handing us evidence that our old assumptions are expiring, about the climate, about our technology, about what's medically possible, and we get to choose how we respond to that. We can be caught flat-footed, defending against last century's flood and prosecuting the last person in a broken chain. Or we can be like those engineers in Madrid, looking clearly at where the old limits have failed and deliberately, carefully building something better. The records are falling, one way or another. The only real question is whether we're the ones caught off guard by it or the ones doing the building. Take care of each other, check on the folks you know in the Midwest, and I'll see you next time.